It was a typical Friday evening at Le Grand Table, the upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. The air buzzed with the sound of soft chatter, clinking glasses, and the occasional hum of satisfaction from diners savoring their meals. The dim lighting, paired with the rich scent of freshly prepared dishes, created an ambience that oozed sophistication. It was a place where the city's elite gathered to experience food as art, and Chef Derek, the man behind the magic, prided himself on being the artist. Chef Derek stood tall in his kitchen, overseeing every detail with a stern gaze. He was in his late 40s, with silver streaks in his dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a presence that demanded respect. His reputation had grown over the years, not just for his culinary skills, but for his sharp, no-nonsense attitude. To Derek, food wasn't just a meal, it was an experience, and he made sure his guests knew it. He was particularly proud of his clientele, polished, wealthy, and, most importantly, appreciative of his high-class culinary creations. That's why, when Marcus, a casually dressed black man in his early 30s, walked through the doors, Derek didn't give him a second glance. From the moment Marcus entered, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not one of hostility, but of judgment. Marcus didn't fit the mold of the typical Le Grand Table patron. He was wearing a simple black turtleneck and dark jeans, his presence quiet but confident. Derek, who was overseeing the evening from the kitchen pass, noticed him immediately and couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Table for one?" the hostess asked, trying to mask her own surprise at his solo appearance. "Yes, just me," Marcus responded, offering her a polite smile. As Marcus was seated, Derek turned to one of his sous chefs, nodding in Marcus's direction. "Take a good look," he muttered under his breath. "What do you bet he orders a steak well done?" The sous chef chuckled awkwardly, unsure if Derek was joking or not. The head chef had a reputation for being tough on his staff, and even tougher on guests who didn't fit his idea of worthy diners. From the moment Marcus picked up the menu, the tension in the air thickened. Derek kept one eye on him as he moved through the evening's tasks, half expecting Marcus to make some sort of faux pas, like asking for ketchup with his filet mignon. He watched as Marcus perused the menu with calm deliberation, his finger tracing over the different options. After a few minutes, Marcus waved the server over, a young woman who had only recently started at Le Grand Table. She approached cautiously, already aware of the subtle judgments Derek had been casting from the kitchen. "I'll start with the truffle risotto," Marcus said. "Could you tell me how the seasoning is balanced? I'm particularly interested in how the truffle flavor is highlighted without overpowering the dish." The server, slightly taken aback by the thoughtful question, smiled and promised to ask the chef. When she relayed the question to Derek, he snorted. "He wants to know about the seasoning." Derek scoffed. "Tell him not to worry. I'm sure it's better than anything he's ever had." The server hesitated, but seeing no other option, relayed the chef's words verbatim. Marcus smiled politely, not showing any signs of offense, though the condescension in Derek's response had been unmistakable. As the risotto arrived, Marcus took his time, savoring the dish. Every bite was measured, every flavor considered. When the server came back to check on him, he nodded, clearly satisfied with the food. But then he asked another question. "The balance is good," Marcus said thoughtfully, "but I'm curious. Is the saffron used from Spain or India? The flavor profile seems to suggest one over the other." This time, the server wasn't sure how to answer and returned to the kitchen once more. When Derek heard the question, his patience wore thin. "Who does this guy think he is?" Derek muttered. "He's trying to act like he knows more than me about saffron. Please." He wiped his hands on his apron and waved off the server's question. "Just tell him it's from wherever he wants it to be from." Again, Marcus received the answer with a polite nod, but the conversation had caught the attention of a few other guests nearby. The server, visibly uncomfortable, hurried back to the kitchen. Derek, feeling proud of his witty response, barely gave Marcus another thought as the night progressed. To him, Marcus was just another diner trying too hard to impress. A customer who, in Derek's mind, didn't belong in the exclusive circle of Le Grand Table's elite patrons. Derek had faced countless customers like him over the years, people who wanted to challenge his expertise, but ultimately lacked the knowledge to do so. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. After the main course arrived, an exquisitely plated lamb dish, Marcus flagged down the server once again. "I noticed something interesting about the way the lamb is seared," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "There's a distinct flavor here that suggests an herb crusting technique. It's good, but it's missing something." The server froze. She knew Derek wouldn't take kindly to another critique, but Marcus's tone wasn't disrespectful, it was curious, analytical. When the server returned to Derek with Marcus's latest comment, the chef's face darkened. "Missing something?" he repeated, incredulously. "Does he want to come back here and cook it himself?" This time, Derek had had enough. "Fine," he grumbled. "I'll go talk to him myself." The restaurant staff watched nervously as Derek stormed out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He approached Marcus's table, a forced smile on his face. So Derek began, his voice dripping with faux politeness. "I hear you have some thoughts about my food." Marcus looked up calmly as Chef Derek stood by his table, the subtle arrogance in Derek's posture and tone unmistakable. There was an awkward silence, with the nearby table stealing glances at the interaction. The tension in the air was thick, and it was clear to everyone that Derek wasn't there to listen to feedback, he was there to prove a point. "Yes," Chef Marcus began, folding his hands in his lap and maintaining a respectful tone. "I wanted to compliment the execution on the lamb, but I noticed that the herb crusting lacks a certain depth. It's well done, but I think the flavor profile could benefit from a hint more rosemary. It would bring out the richness of the lamb." Derek's smile faltered slightly. He wasn't used to being critiqued, especially not by someone who, in his mind, had no right to question his expertise. He crossed his arms and leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure you think so," Derek said, barely concealing his irritation, "but the dish is exactly as it's supposed to be. You see, we don't serve basic flavors here. Maybe that's what you're used to, but we prefer something a little more sophisticated." Marcus remained unfazed, his calm demeanor only serving to further irritate Derek. It was clear Marcus was choosing his words carefully, not rising to the bait. He simply nodded, taking another measured bite of the lamb, as if savoring the dish despite Derek's attitude. "I understand," Chef Marcus replied, placing his fork down with quiet grace. "I appreciate your attention to detail, and the dish is well prepared. I was only suggesting that the rosemary might enhance the natural flavors even further. But of course, you know your kitchen better than anyone." Derek's ego flared at that last comment. The chef had spent years building his reputation, creating an atmosphere where his word was gospel, and no one dared to challenge his authority, least of all a customer like Marcus, who, in Derek's eyes, clearly didn't belong in a place like this. "I'm glad you understand," Derek replied, his voice dripping with insincerity. "You see, this isn't the kind of restaurant where we cater to everyone's palate. We have a certain standard here. Some people just don't get it." The underlying message was clear. Derek wasn't just questioning Marcus's knowledge of food, he was implying that Marcus, by virtue of who he was, I couldn't possibly understand the complexity and refinement of the cuisine served at Le Grand Table. It was a veiled insult, one that wasn't lost on Marcus. But Marcus didn't react. Instead, he looked Derek squarely in the eye, his calm smile unwavering. "I see," Marcus said evenly. "Well, I'll be sure to mention your unique approach in my review." Derek blinked, caught off guard by the word review. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it just as quickly, unsure of what Marcus meant. There was an uncomfortable pause as Derek tried to size him up, but Marcus remained composed, as if he knew something Derek didn't. Sensing he wasn't going to get the reaction he wanted, Derek forced another smile. "I'm sure you will," he said curtly, turning on his heel and marching back toward the kitchen. His frustration was palpable as he muttered to himself, loud enough for his staff to hear. "What does he know about food anyway?" Derek scoffed as he re-entered the kitchen. "I swear, the nerve of some people, coming in here and acting like they can critique my dishes, as if they know better than me." The kitchen staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. Derek was known for his temper, but this was a new level of condescension. They had all heard Marcus's calm, measured critiques, and while none of them would dare to say it out loud, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, Marcus had a point. But Derek wasn't about to entertain that thought. To him, Marcus was just another diner who didn't appreciate true culinary art, and he wasn't going to let one bad interaction ruin his evening. He busied himself with the next orders, barking instructions at his staff with renewed intensity, as if trying to shake off the encounter. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his meal, quietly observing the staff and the other patrons. He was well aware of the whispers, the sideways glances cast his way, but he didn't mind. He was used to it, used to being underestimated, judged by the way he looked rather than the expertise he carried, and tonight was no different. As Marcus finished his meal, the server approached with a nervous smile. "Would you like to see the dessert menu?" she asked, her voice slightly shaky, as if unsure how to navigate the tension between Marcus and the chef. Marcus smiled warmly at her, putting her at ease. "Sure," he replied. "I'd love to see what the chef has in mind for dessert." When the dessert arrived, a beautifully plated lemon tart, Marcus took his time, savoring the delicate balance of sweet and tart flavors. But even as he enjoyed the dish, his thoughts lingered on the earlier encounter with Derek. There was a lesson to be learned here, one that Derek hadn't yet realized. But soon, very soon, Derek would understand just how much he had underestimated Marcus. As Marcus prepared to leave, he called the server over one last time. "Please tell Chef Derek that the meal was memorable," he said, his tone genuine, "and that I'll be sure to write about it in detail." The server nodded, still unsure of the subtext behind Marcus's words, but she dutifully passed the message on to Derek, who barely gave it a second thought. "Write about it," Derek scoffed. "Let him write whatever he wants, like it's going to make a difference." And with that, Derek dismissed the entire evening as just another interaction with an unappreciative customer. Little did he know, that review would change everything. A few days passed since Marcus's visit to Le Grand Table, and Chef Derek had almost forgotten about the encounter. The restaurant continued to operate as usual, with a steady stream of high-profile guests and food critics walking through its doors. To Derek, Marcus had been just another nobody, someone who didn't truly appreciate fine dining. But that was about to change. One quiet afternoon, Derek was in the kitchen preparing for the evening's rush when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message notification from one of his longtime friends in the culinary world. The message was brief, but it was enough to grab Derek's attention. "Check out the new Michelin review. You're in it." Derek's heart skipped a beat. Michelin reviews were everything in the fine dining world. A good review could elevate a restaurant's status, while a bad one could be catastrophic. He wiped his hands on a nearby towel and quickly opened his phone, scrolling through the notifications until he found the link to the review. As he skimmed the page, Derek's initial excitement turned to confusion. The review didn't start with the usual glowing praise that he was accustomed to. Instead, it began with a detailed account of an unpleasant dining experience, specifically referencing a meal at Le Grand Table. At a glance, Le Grand Table is a restaurant that exudes class and sophistication, the review read. But beneath the surface, a deeper problem lurks. While the food may impress at first bite, it's the attitude of the head chef that leaves a sour taste in the mouth. Derek's stomach tightened as he read on. The reviewer, without naming names, described a condescending chef who ridiculed a customer's palate and dismissed thoughtful critiques. The review went on to criticize the way the chef had handled a simple question about saffron, making snide remarks that alienated the customer and created an uncomfortable atmosphere. For a restaurant of this caliber, one would expect the chef to be as refined in demeanor as in technique, the review continued. Unfortunately, this was not the case during my visit. Derek's hands trembled as he scrolled to the bottom of the review. It was only then that he realized who had written it: Marcus. The man he had dismissed so easily just a few nights ago was no ordinary diner. He was a Michelin-starred judge, a man with the power to make or break reputations in the world of fine dining. The kitchen was unusually quiet as Derek stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of his eyes. His staff had noticed the change in his demeanor, but no one dared to ask what had happened. Derek's face had gone pale, his confident bravado replaced with something unfamiliar fear. He glanced up from his phone, his eyes scanning the kitchen, but he wasn't really seeing anything. His mind was racing. How could he have been so careless? He had insulted a Michelin-starred judge, someone with the influence to completely undo everything he had worked for. Derek slammed his phone down on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen. The staff jumped, exchanging uneasy glances. They had never seen Derek like this before. He was always the picture of control, the man who ran the kitchen with an iron fist. But now he looked vulnerable, shaken. "What's wrong?" one of his sous chefs finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Derek didn't respond at first. His mind was still reeling from the realization of what he had done. Finally, he muttered, "Nothing. Get back to work." But it was far from nothing. Derek's reputation, his entire career, was now hanging by a thread. The review didn't outright condemn the restaurant, but it had cast a shadow over its reputation. Marcus had praised the technical aspects of the food, noting that the flavors were well executed and the presentation was flawless. But the scathing critique of Derek's attitude was what stuck out the most. No amount of culinary skill can make up for a lack of respect, the review concluded. Le Grand Table's chef would do well to remember that fine dining is not just about the food, but about the entire experience. Unfortunately, this experience left much to be desired. The words stung. Derek had spent years cultivating an image of perfection, believing that his food alone was enough to keep people coming back. But now he realized that it wasn't just about the dishes he created, it was about the way he treated people, the way he carried himself. For the first time in a long while, Derek felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Doubt. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, barely able to focus on the dinner preparations. Every dish he tasted seemed bland. Every order he barked to his staff sounded hollow. His mind kept drifting back to the review, to Marcus, and to the countless times he had brushed off customers in the same dismissive way. As the evening service began, Derek tried to push the thoughts aside, but it was no use. Each time a new customer walked through the door, he found himself wondering who they were, what kind of influence they might have. He no longer saw them as just diners now. They were potential threats to his carefully constructed world. And then, as if the universe wasn't done teaching him a lesson, another familiar face walked through the door that evening. It was Marcus. Dressed just as casually as before, Marcus entered the restaurant with the same calm confidence that had unnerved Derek the first time. But now, Derek knew exactly who he was dealing with, and the sight of Marcus made his pulse quicken. As Marcus was seated, Derek watched from the kitchen, unsure of what to do. Should he go out there and apologize? Should he stay hidden and hope Marcus didn't recognize him? The questions raced through his mind, but before he could come to a decision, Marcus waved over the server. This time, Marcus didn't order a meal. Instead, he simply asked, "Is Chef Derek in tonight? I'd like to speak with him." Derek's heart pounded as he stood frozen in the kitchen, watching from a distance as Marcus spoke to the server. He hadn't expected Marcus to return so soon, if at all. The last thing Derek wanted was another confrontation, especially after reading the review that had already started making waves in the culinary community. But there was no avoiding it. Marcus had specifically asked for him. The server hesitated, clearly sensing the tension. She glanced toward the kitchen, her eyes meeting Derek's for a brief moment. She was unsure whether to proceed, but she couldn't exactly refuse a customer's request. After a brief pause, she made her way back to the kitchen, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Derek could feel the eyes of his staff on him, waiting to see how he would react. The room was thick with anticipation. "Chef," the server said quietly as she approached, her voice barely above a whisper. "The gentleman at table 3, he's asking to speak with you again." Derek inhaled sharply, feeling a wave of nausea wash over him. There was no getting out of this. If he refused, it would only make things worse. And after everything that had happened, the last thing he needed was to add fuel to the fire. He wiped his hands on his apron, trying to calm himself. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll go." The walk from the kitchen to Marcus's table felt like the longest of Derek's life. Every step was heavy with dread, every breath shallow as he approached the man who had the power to dismantle his career with a single sentence. As Derek reached the table, Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression calm, as it had been during their previous encounter. He offered Derek a polite nod, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that Derek hadn't noticed before, a quiet intensity that made him uneasy. "Chef Derek," Marcus said evenly, his tone neutral. "Thank you for coming over. I wanted to talk to you about something." Derek stood there, unsure of how to respond. He had never felt this uncertain in his own restaurant, a place where he usually ruled with absolute authority. Now he was at the mercy of the man seated before him. "I read your review," Derek finally said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. I wanted to apologize for how I acted the other night. It wasn't my best moment." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, chef, but I didn't ask you over just for an apology." Derek's heart sank. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. He braced himself, waiting for Marcus to continue. "You see," Marcus began, leaning back slightly in his chair, "I've been in this industry for a long time. I've eaten at some of the best restaurants in the world, and I've met chefs from all walks of life. Some are humble, and some like yourself are talented, but, let's say, lacking in a few areas." Derek felt a flash of anger at Marcus's words, but he bit his tongue. He couldn't afford to lose his temper now. "Look," Marcus continued, his voice still calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I respect your skill in the kitchen. You clearly know your way around a dish. But what you don't seem to understand is that fine dining isn't just about the food. It's about the entire experience, and that experience includes how you treat your guests." Derek swallowed hard. He knew Marcus was right. The review had made that abundantly clear, but hearing it from Marcus's mouth, in person, made it sting even more. "I've seen chefs like you before," Derek Marcus went on. "You're so wrapped up in your own ego that you forget the most important thing: the people sitting at your tables. Without them, your skills mean nothing. You can serve the most exquisite food in the world, but if you alienate your customers, you won't last long in this industry." Derek's face flushed with embarrassment. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had been under stress, that he hadn't meant to come across the way he did. But deep down, he knew those were just excuses. Marcus had seen through him from the start. "I know that review hurt," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. "But I didn't write it to destroy you. I wrote it because I believe you can do better. You have the talent, Derek, but talent isn't enough. Not anymore." Derek stood there, his mind racing. He had never been talked to like this before. Not by a customer, and certainly not by a Michelin judge. But as much as he wanted to push back, to reject Marcus's words, he couldn't. Marcus wasn't just criticizing him, he was offering him a way forward. What do you want me to do?" Derek asked finally, his voice quieter than usual, almost subdued. Marcus looked him in the eye, his gaze steady. "I want you to learn from this," he said simply. "Take a step back. Rethink how you approach your guests, your staff, your whole philosophy. Because if you don't, this restaurant won't last, no matter how good your food is." Derek's stomach churned. The thought of losing everything he had worked for was unbearable, but Marcus's words were like a cold splash of reality, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long. His success wasn't just about him. It never had been. Marcus stood up, ready to leave. He placed a business card on the table, sliding it toward Derek. "Here's my number," Marcus said. "If you ever want to talk, or if you need advice, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm not here to ruin your career, Derek. I'm here because I see potential in you. But it's up to you whether you're willing to change." Derek stared at the card, feeling a mix of shame, gratitude, and something else, hope. For the first time in years, someone had given him honest, unfiltered feedback. And as much as it stung, Derek knew Marcus was offering him something valuable, a chance to grow, to be better. Marcus nodded one last time before turning to leave. "Good luck," Sheffy said over his shoulder as he walked out of the restaurant. Derek stood there in silence, his hands trembling as he picked up the card. He glanced around the dining room, where guests continued their meals, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. But for Derek, nothing felt the same anymore. The words Marcus had spoken echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Change. It wasn't a word Derek liked. He had spent his entire career doing things his way, believing that his talent alone was enough. But now, standing in the middle of his own restaurant, he realized that if he didn't change, everything he had built would crumble around him. And for the first time, Derek felt the weight of that realization fully sink in. Derek spent the following days in deep reflection. The bustling energy of Le Grand Table continued, as it always had, with customers coming in, placing orders, and leaving. But for Derek, the world seemed quieter, slower. He found himself lost in thought more often than not, replaying Marcus's words over and over in his mind. The review had made its rounds in the culinary world. While it didn't completely tarnish the restaurant's reputation, it was a blow to Derek's ego and a wake-up call to the reality he had ignored for far too long. There were whispers among his staff, a new dynamic in the kitchen, where the once infallible chef now appeared, human. On a particularly slow afternoon, Derek sat alone in his office staring at Marcus's business card. He had kept it close since that night, unsure whether he would actually use it. A part of him still resisted the idea of asking for help, of admitting that he needed to change. But the larger part of him, the part that had been humbled by Marcus's critique, knew it was time. Derek picked up his phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Marcus," came the calm, steady voice on the other end. Derek hesitated for a moment, feeling a lump in his throat. "It's Derek," he finally said. "From Le Grand Table. We spoke a few nights ago." There was a pause, and for a moment, Derek worried that Marcus might not want to speak with him. But then Marcus's voice came through, warm and welcoming. "Chef Derek," Marcus said. "I wasn't sure if you were going to call. I'm glad you did." Derek exhaled slowly, relieved but still unsure of how to proceed. "Look, I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his words cautious, "about the way I run my kitchen, the way I treat people. I don't know if I'm ready to admit I've been wrong, but I think I need some guidance. I don't want this place to fall apart." There was another pause, and Derek could almost hear Marcus smiling on the other end of the line. "It takes a lot to admit that," Chef Marcus said. "The fact that you're reaching out means you're already taking the first step. No one expects perfection, Derek, but people do expect respect. I think you can turn things around if you're willing to put in the work." Derek nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed that hard work and discipline were the keys to success. But now he realized there was more to it than that. There was a human side to the restaurant business that he had neglected for far too long. "What do I do?" Derek asked, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. Marcus's tone was thoughtful. "Start by listening," he said. "Listen to your staff. Listen to your customers. You're a brilliant chef, Derek, but brilliance doesn't mean much if people don't want to work with you or eat your food. You've got to rebuild trust, and that starts with humility." Derek sat back in his chair, letting the words sink in. He had always thought of himself as the authority, the one who knew better than anyone else, but now he realized that his arrogance had driven a wedge between himself and the very people who kept his restaurant alive. "It won't be easy," Marcus continued. "Changing your approach, especially after so many years, is going to feel uncomfortable. But if you're serious about keeping Le Grand Table successful, it's necessary." Derek closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the truth in Marcus's words. "I am serious," he said quietly. "I don't want to lose everything I've worked for, and I don't want to keep alienating people, especially not my staff. I need to learn how to be better." Marcus's response was gentle but firm. "You will. One step at a time, Derek. You have the talent, but now it's time to develop the character to match it. I can help you with that, but it's going to take effort on your part." Derek nodded again, feeling a strange mixture of hope and fear. This wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path, one that didn't just focus on his culinary prowess, but on who he was as a leader, a mentor, and a person. "I'll do whatever it takes," Derek said finally. "I want to make this right." Marcus's voice softened. "That's all I needed to hear. Let's meet up next week, and we'll start from there." Derek hung up the phone, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a new beginning. He stared at the phone for a long moment, his thoughts swirling with uncertainty and anticipation. The next day, Derek walked into the restaurant with a new resolve. His staff noticed the shift immediately. He wasn't barking orders as usual. Instead, he was quieter, more observant. He took the time to listen to the chefs as they discussed the menu, asking for their opinions rather than imposing his own. It was a small change, but it didn't go unnoticed. At one point during the day, Derek called a meeting with his entire staff. They gathered in the dining room, curious about what had prompted the unusual assembly. "I wanted to talk to all of you," Derek began, his tone more humble than anyone had ever heard before. "I know I haven't always been the easiest person to work for. I've made mistakes, and I've let my ego get in the way of what's best for this restaurant. But that's going to change." The staff exchanged surprised glances, unsure of where this was going. "I want to rebuild trust," Derek continued, "not just with our customers, but with all of you. This place doesn't run without the hard work you all put in, and I've taken that for granted. So from now on, things are going to be different. I'm going to start listening more, and I want your feedback on how we can improve together." For a moment, there was silence. The staff, who had grown accustomed to Derek's authoritarian style, weren't sure how to react. But then, one of the sous chefs, Lena, spoke up. "We appreciate that, chef," she said cautiously. "It's a big change." Derek nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "It is. But it's a necessary one. And I'm counting on all of you to help me make this restaurant better than it's ever been." Slowly, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The staff, though still uncertain, could sense that Derek was sincere. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but this was a step in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, a noticeable transformation took place at Le Grand Table. The kitchen, once a place of tension and sharp commands, began to evolve into a more collaborative space. Derek, true to his word, started listening more, asking for input from his staff on menu adjustments, flavors, and presentation. At first, the changes were small, but they quickly gained momentum. One evening, as the restaurant buzzed with its usual crowd, the shift in Derek's attitude was on full display. A customer, unsure of what to order, asked the server for Derek's recommendation. Instead of dismissing the question as trivial or ignoring it altogether, Derek personally approached the table, smiling warmly at the guest. "I recommend the duck tonight," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "We've been experimenting with a new glaze using citrus and a hint of lavender. I'd love to hear what you think of it." The customer, taken aback by Derek's personal attention, beamed. "That sounds incredible. I'll definitely try it." Derek returned to the kitchen, a subtle sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had begun to realize that it wasn't just about the food, it was about the experience. Marcus had been right all along. His talent in the kitchen was only part of what made a great restaurant. The way he connected with his guests and staff mattered just as much, if not more. Meanwhile, the staff noticed the difference too. Lena, who had been one of Derek's most skilled but hesitant sous chefs, began to come out of her shell. She offered suggestions on new dishes, some of which Derek incorporated into the menu. The collaborative atmosphere brought a fresh energy to the kitchen, and everyone seemed more invested in the restaurant's success. But the real test came a few weeks later when Marcus visited again. This time, Derek was ready. As soon as Marcus walked through the door, Derek spotted him and immediately approached with a smile that, for once, wasn't forced or defensive. "Marcus," Derek said, extending a hand, "it's good to see you again. I've been waiting for your return." Marcus shook his hand, a knowing smile on his face. "I've been hearing some good things about the place," he said. "Figured I'd come back and see the changes for myself." Derek led Marcus to a table personally and made sure he had the best service possible. He didn't hover, but he stayed attentive, ensuring that Marcus's dining experience was seamless. Throughout the meal, Derek kept an eye on him, waiting for any sign that Marcus might offer feedback, positive or negative. When the meal was over, Marcus waved Derek over again. This time, Derek felt a strange sense of calm as he approached. He wasn't nervous like before. He had done the work, and he was ready to hear whatever Marcus had to say. "I have to say," Marcus began, dabbing his mouth with a napkin, "the difference is night and day. The food was excellent, as always, but the real improvement is in the atmosphere. It feels lighter in here, more welcoming." Derek's chest swelled with pride. He nodded, but he didn't interrupt. He wanted to hear more. "The staff seems happier too," Marcus continued. "It's clear you've made some changes, not just in the way you cook, but in the way you lead. And that, chef, makes all the difference." Derek felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. "Thank you, Marcus," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done it without your advice. You made me realize how much more there was to this business than just the food. I needed to hear that, even if it stung at first." Marcus smiled, nodding in approval. "It's not easy to change, Derek. Most people never do. But you took the challenge head on, and it shows. This place has the potential to go even further now, and I'm glad I could help." Derek felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to prove himself to anyone. He had finally found the balance between creating exceptional food and being the kind of leader and chef his staff and customers could respect. "I'd love to stay in touch," Derek said, as Marcus stood to leave. "I still have a lot to learn, and your insight has been invaluable." Marcus shook his hand once more. "Anytime, chef. You've come a long way, but the journey doesn't stop here. Keep pushing yourself, keep listening, and this place will only get better." As Marcus left, Derek stood at the front of the restaurant, watching him disappear into the night. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The lessons Marcus had taught him weren't just about food or running a successful restaurant. They were about growth, humility, and the importance of respecting everyone who walked through the doors, whether they were a customer or a member of his staff. The review that had once felt like a death sentence for his career had become the catalyst for change. Derek had been forced to confront his own flaws and rebuild from the ground up. And while the road hadn't been easy, he had emerged from it a better chef, a better leader, and, most importantly, a better person. As the night continued and the last of the diners left the restaurant, Derek stood in the kitchen, watching his staff finish their closing tasks. He no longer saw them as mere employees, but as partners in this journey. Together, they had built something greater than just a place to eat. They had built a community. Le Grande Pable had become more than a restaurant. It had become a place where people came to be nourished not just by the food, but by the experience, the warmth, and the respect that now defined the heart of its kitchen. Derek smiled to himself as he flipped off the lights and closed the door behind him. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready for them. He had learned the most valuable lesson of all. It wasn't just about being the best chef, it was about being the kind of person people wanted to follow. And with that, he walked into the night, confident that his journey was just beginning.